President Obama has said he won't support a UN declaration of an independent Palestinian state. Now he just has to get the Europeans on his side. But the proposal is already gaining support, and Israel and the US risk being left out in the cold. This is Inside Story. Hello there, welcome to the programme. I'm Shudi Ghosh. President Barack Obama is in Europe this week and he has a very important task on his agenda. He'll be trying to persuade European leaders not to support a UN declaration of Palestinian statehood in September. It comes after a very public clash with the Israeli Prime Minister over what borders any peace deal will be based on. Obama's hoping that by standing up to Benjamin Netanyahu and focusing on 1967 boundaries, he'll convince Europeans to stick with the stagnant peace process. Rosalind Jordan reports.
So many speeches.
America has no better friend than Israel.
So little progress.
Israel's legitimacy is not a matter for debate.
The opening salvo, U.S. President Barack Obama's moment of opportunity speech on the Middle East.
We believe the borders of Israel and Palestine should be based on the 1967 lines with mutually agreed swaps.
Netanyahu pushed back.
A peace based on illusions will crash eventually on the rocks of Middle Eastern reality.
But Obama didn't flinch, calling it a matter of national security.
Israelis and Palestinians will negotiate a border that is different than the one that existed on June 4th, 1967.
2 days later, Netanyahu didn't flinch either.
Israel will not return to the indefensible boundaries of 1967.
But Netanyahu has long been aware of the U.S.'s position that the 1967 lines were the starting point, given this joint statement after his meeting with Hillary Clinton 6 months ago. Quote, those requirements will be fully taken into account in any future peace agreement. It seems the two leaders were talking at each other. Analysts say the recent week of back and forth on the Mideast peace process shows that people are worried about the situation. The problem is figuring out the best way forward. Obama understands what's at stake for all three sides, but
the president, having reiterated his understanding and his analysis of the role that this conflict plays for U.S. interests in the region, needs to really commit to crafting a process with clear terms of reference.
Even so, it's still up to the Israelis and the Palestinians to prove that they're ready to give ground, literal or figurative, for peace. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera at the State Department.
Well, there's a lot to talk about. Let me introduce my guests today. In Washington, D.C., Reuel Marc Gerecht, a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, also a former Middle East specialist at the CIA. In London, Patrick Seale, author of Struggle for Arab Independence. And in Cairo, Ezzedine Choukri Fishere, a professor of international politics at the American University in Cairo. Gentlemen, welcome to the programme. Ezzedine, let me start with you. It was interesting listening to that clash of wills between Netanyahu and Obama. How much do you think Obama's stance on the 67 borders was a message to Europe?
Well, I think the line on the 1967, as you said in the introduction, is not an entire novelty in the American position, and it's definitely not an innovation as far as international community's consensus on the Arab-Israeli conflict is concerned. So the point now is the fact that Obama is referring to the 1967 specifically with the other component, which is the security arrangements he mentioned. I think basically what Obama is doing is providing the potential Israeli and Palestinian negotiators with parameters that they can use in their negotiation. And this is something that both the Palestinians and the Arab partners were complaining that the lack of those parameters make the bilateral negotiation basically useless and going nowhere. So stepping in with those parameters, I think, is aimed at providing a framework that could be used if you're really serious about resuming negotiations.
But do you think the Europeans will be convinced that those parameters and that vision, the US vision of that process, is the right one?
I think many people are convinced that the parameters are the right ones. The problem is not now in the parameters. The problem is there is no genuine negotiation process. There is no faith that Netanyahu and his government are really interested in a serious negotiation. And so the question becomes, either in Europe or in the region, is this another way of stalling and giving us a process that goes nowhere in order to abort the current drive towards unilateral independence and going to the General Assembly in September in the UN? Or is this a genuine effort aimed at resuming negotiations? I think with the response we got from Netanyahu, basically we got the answer. As long as the Likud government and Netanyahu is prime minister, or as long as they are in government and Netanyahu is prime minister, there is going to be no genuine negotiation aimed at creating a Palestinian state on 1967 lines. And therefore, ultimately, all of this is pushing in the direction of a unilateral declaration of statehood and going to the United Nations in September.
Let me bring Reuel in here. The peace process has been dead for so long. I mean, why should anyone put their faith in the US ability to restart it?
Well, that's a good question. I actually don't think that President Obama is going to expend an enormous amount of capital on this issue. His real subject in that first speech, not the one at AIPAC, was actually the Arab Revolt. This was a secondary issue. And I'd even go so far as to say that I think the president was probably a little bit surprised by the hornet's nest that he sparked by discussing the 67 borders.
You say it was a secondary issue. I mean, clearly there was a focus on the border issue, but he was very tough on any notion about isolating Israel, as he called it, at the UN.
Well, yeah, I mean but that's not. I mean, that's not new. I mean, that is a consistent American position, and I don't think President Obama is going to stray from that. And I would be surprised, actually, if this becomes a significant transatlantic issue. I think there are so many other issues: Libya, the financial debt crisis, the euro, Egypt, that are going to be far more important for U.S.-European relations. And again, I just emphasize that if Abu Mazen goes ahead with a unilateral declaration, and he does it any time around the elections in Egypt, I think you will find this declaration to come off more like a pop than a bang.
OK. Patrick, what's your take on that? Do you think the Palestinians have any alternatives from going to the General Assembly?
I personally don't think they have. You see, you said Obama was standing up to Netanyahu. He wasn't. He collapsed. Obama has collapsed. One of the most extraordinary features of the international scene today is the way Israel and its American friends have taken control of America's Middle East policy. It's an astonishing phenomenon. Now, a lot of things follow from this. I mean, it's certainly, in terms of the Europeans, it poses a very serious dilemma for them. You see, they are concerned for their security, and all their security people tell them that a source of terror, a source of violence, is precisely this unresolved Arab-Israeli conflict. Another source, of course, is the militarization of American foreign policy. But Obama simply collapsed. He said, even on the question of the 67 borders, which he mentioned in his first speech, but in his second speech, he then made clear that it wouldn't be that border at all. He said it would have to be mutually agreed swaps, and the agreement would have to be between a lion and a mouse, between the Israelis.
Yeah, he did make the point that the 67 borders, it wouldn't look the same today as it did back in June 67.
He said a whole series of no's, you see. No to their demand for recognition of their state, no to Hamas, and most importantly, no to any imposed peace, which is shorthand for saying no pressure on Israel. It was altogether grossly biased.
I can see Ezzedine wants to say something to that. What's your view, Ezzedine?
Yes. I think I think this is the discussion that we could have had in December last year, and this is where we were. I think there is some change that happened in the region, and this change is, in a way, is a game changer as far as Arab-Israeli conflict is concerned. No one here is really talking about the United States or its position. No one expects the U.S. to be either an honest broker or to put pressure on Israel. I think we as Arab populations have moved beyond this point. And this is why I'm saying that the main game today is no longer the negotiation. The main game today is the drive towards building a Palestinian state, whether through a unilateral declaration of statehood or in the UN, or pushing for sanctions against Israel if the occupation continues. The only thing that I think Obama was right on spot on is when he said that everyone in the international community, and definitely in the region, is sick and tired of this conflict and sick and tired of the continuation of occupation. We are past this point. There is a genuine change in the region. This change offers opportunities but also risks. And I think if we are smart enough and we can gear this towards some kind of a peaceful resolution of the conflict, but it's not going to look anything like the old peace process and the bilateral negotiations we had. We are past this point. This point is not coming back. We're not going back to this kind of negotiation, I think, ever.
OK, well, let's have a look at what President Obama had to say about the prospect of a UN vote on this. He says any vote for an independent Palestine at the United Nations General Assembly would be opposed by the US, and the move wouldn't serve the interests of the Palestinian people.
What the United Nations is not going to be able to do is deliver a Palestinian state. The only way that we're going to see a Palestinian state is if Israelis and Palestinians agree on a just peace. And so I strongly believe that for the Palestinians to take the United Nations route rather than the path of sitting down and talking with the Israelis is a mistake.
Reuel, Obama makes the point that you can't just magically create a state without discussing things like security and borders beforehand.
Yeah, well, I think you're probably going to have to discuss more of that. I don't really think this is going anywhere until you see new elections among the Palestinians. I mean, right now we have an American-supported police state on the West Bank. We have an Iranian-supported police state in the Gaza. And until you actually see free and fair elections amongst the Palestinians, and you see what the Palestinians really want to do, I don't think this is going to move anywhere, and I think...
But that is coming, again, isn't it? I mean, they've had this reconciliation, they've agreed a date for elections.
Supposedly, we'll see. I mean, both the United States and the European Union have the same view of Hamas, and that is it's a terrorist organization. I'm deeply skeptical that you're going to find the Europeans being willing to jump over that. And I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that, say, the Germans,
David Cameron, the British
the
Prime
French,
Minister,
the Dutch,
stood right next to him whilst Obama was saying that the US couldn't support a UN vote. And David Cameron said, look, if and when it comes to the General Assembly, then we will discuss it along with our European partners.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm just saying I think it's a mistake to assume that the EU is going to vote as a bloc. Again, I think it's highly likely that you may get some dissent in Germany, even France, Poland, the Czech Republic. There are many places where people may look upon this with a great deal of trepidation. So, again, I think for Abu Mazen's sake, I think he's probably going in this direction, but he may discover that this self-declaration may turn out to be quite counterproductive, and it may even be beneficial to Hamas.
Well, we have had a look at how Europe would react to this, and several European nations are considering recognising a Palestinian state when the General Assembly meets in September. French President Nicolas Sarkozy has said if the peace process is still dead in September, France will face up to its responsibilities on the central question of recognition of a Palestinian state. And Britain also indicated it was thinking along the same lines. A spokesman at the UN said nothing is off the table with regard to recognition in September. However, Germany, a close ally of Israel, takes a different view. Foreign Minister Guido Westerwelle said there's no alternative to the two-state solution arrived at via negotiations. Patrick, how much do the Palestinians need European support to make this declaration of a Palestinian state credible?
You see, the Europeans are getting very impatient with Israel. It's patently clear that Netanyahu doesn't want a settlement. He wants land. He's land hungry. He wants to delay a negotiation as long as possible so that the settlement process can continue. Even on the eve of his visit to Washington, he defiantly declared that another 1,500 housing units were going to be built in East Jerusalem. So you see, the Europeans are worried about this, worried for their own security. They're frightened of the possibility of a third intifada, which might go beyond the frontiers of Israel and Palestine.
But isn't there not a risk of more violence if a Palestinian state is recognised? I mean, there are those within Israel who feel that this will lead to more clashes directed against Israel.
Look, Netanyahu talks a lot about security. He wants security for Israel. He's guaranteeing insecurity for Israel for the foreseeable future. You can't keep millions of people down under military occupation or under siege so that their daily lives are constantly disrupted and expect them not to react.
But I'll put the same question to you that I asked Reuel. How can you just magic a Palestinian state out of thin air without discussing the tough issues, the issues which need to be decided through face-to-face negotiation?
Their whole policy has been to radicalize the Palestinians so that they can then say, how can you negotiate with somebody who wants to kill you, who wants to destroy you? As if they hadn't been trying to destroy Hamas. I mean, the whole thing is so cockeyed, and it's such a shame and a humiliation that the President of the United States should collapse in front of these special interests, which are really not in Israel's long-term future. A small, prosperous Palestinian state in Israel's shadow would be the key to its acceptance into the whole region. It would be the guarantee of its long-term security. Everybody knows this, but greater Israel ideologues like Netanyahu and his right-wing friends and the neocons in America who took America into war with Iraq, largely to protect Israel against any possible attack from Iraq. I mean, these are the people who should be confronted.
All right, well, let me ask Ezzedine, what does a recognition of a Palestinian state mean in practical terms? Will it give it a different legal status?
Yes, I think the contrast here is not between building a Palestinian state peacefully or building it through violence. I think a majority of Palestinians have realized that violence doesn't work. And I think Tunisia and Egypt also gave examples of how nonviolent protest can actually achieve better results than violence. I think a majority understands that violence plays in the hand of extremists, including Netanyahu and Likud. So the question is how you build a Palestinian state. And again, negotiation, of course you will have to negotiate certain things, but once you agree on the outline of a solution, once you say, yes, I accept a Palestinian state that lives next to Israel, along the lines of 1967 with minor swaps that are agreed. Then, once you do this, you say the magic words, then of course you will negotiate border issues and other security arrangements and so on. If we go to the UN, which seems to be the only open road to the Palestinians now, if you go to the UN, you get a declaration of statehood. That's not the end of the process, because as you say, all you get is a statement. Then you will still have to build this statement on the ground. If Israel, this government or a new government, would be willing to negotiate how to implement this, I think this is the moment when you get a fruitful negotiation. But you have to get the point where the outline is agreed.
Well, Patrick makes the point that European nations are fed up with the ongoing, the peace process that goes nowhere. But I would ask you, Ezzedine, whether Europe is also worried about the reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah, and is that the fly in the ointment to all this?
Well, I think the reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah is a source of worry to some Europeans and to some Americans, but it's also good news to others. It depends how you see this reconciliation. If you see the reconciliation as an opportunity where you bring the Palestinians together, and as our American guest has just indicated, the Palestinians are not going to be able to act coherently until you have real elections in Palestine, until you have credible Palestinian Authority in place that responds to the constituencies of both movements and others as well. So the reconciliation, if it's in this direction, which in my view seems to be the case now, I think that's good news because it means you rehabilitate the political players, you rehabilitate the Palestinian Authority and enable it to make serious discussion and to face its own moments of truth. We've seen Khalid Mashal accepting or calling for a Palestinian state on 1967 lines. I think if we continue to go in this direction, then we are in business because, as I said, going to the UN is a way of enacting the two-state solution because negotiations failed, not because we don't like negotiations, because we've been doing it and not getting a Palestinian state that we want.
Let me get Reuel's view on this, because one of the issues for the United States is that it will be isolated along with Israel if this vote does go through. And as we've heard our guest saying, the US is perceived to have failed on the negotiation front, on its view of the peace process.
It's not just a perception.
So, Reuel, what do you say to that? I mean, how worried is the US actually about its influence in the region?
Oh, I think it's worried right now about its influence, but it has almost nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian imbroglio. I think it has to do with the tumult of the Great Arab Revolt, the uncertainty about where this is going. I mean, I just suggest to you, after the elections in Egypt in the fall, assuming this moves forward and the military doesn't betray its intent to have elections and doesn't rig them, that assuming we have elections, I would expect the Muslim Brotherhood to do reasonably well. It's not unlikely they'll get at least 25% of the vote, which influentially I think will be a lot more than that. I would fully expect the Muslim Brotherhood to table a vote to annul the treaty with Israel. Now, Muslim Brotherhood's not in favor of negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis. They're in favor of the end to Israel. Once this happens, I mean, the Palestinian-Israeli imbroglio is going to start to fade in the background. I mean, one of the reasons we had the Nakba festivities, I think, was in part by the Palestinians to actually sort of return the limelight to them, which they had lost by the Great Arab Revolt. That's the issue in the Middle East, is what's going on in Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, and elsewhere.
So what is
I'm just saying the Palestinian-Israeli...
Okay, the Palestinian-Israeli issue isn't top of the U.S. agenda, is what you're saying.
The Americans are going to oppose it. You'll have, I think, probably a split decision amongst the Europeans. I think, as I said before, what's most likely here is that you will discover that Abu Mazen will discover that there's not much to a UN declaration. And that in the end, it's probably going to cause him more harm than good, and it could actually conceivably fortify the position of Hamas, which would be amusing. I don't think that's
Do you agree with that, Patrick? Do you agree with that?
I disagree with it entirely. I think Reuel is totally mistaken in suggesting that the Palestine issue is going to fade away somehow. On the contrary, if you do get democratic regimes in countries like Egypt, Egypt will play a much, much greater role in pressuring Israel to make concessions.
I think I just said that, actually. I think I just said that. I mean, I think
you said a moment ago that the Palestine issue would disappear. It's the one issue which unites the Arabs, and it's the one issue on which they feel very strongly. And it's a source for immense disappointment. It's a source for their immense disappointment with Obama. Now, you see, the general feeling is this, that unless there is some pressure on Israel, Israel is not going to yield. The Europeans are the only people who can put some pressure. It doesn't have to be all 27 of them. It could be a small group, Britain, France, even Germany, possibly some Scandinavian countries. You see, 45% of Israel's trade, Israel's exports, go to Europe. Europe has the ability to put some pressure on Israel and make it understand that peace is so much in its interests rather than an extra kilometre or two of the West Bank, which will guarantee it violence in the future.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for all your contributions. Reuel Marc Gerecht, Patrick Seale and Ezzedine Choukri Fishere. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. You can email us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Until next time, from me, Seale. Bye-bye.